Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. Today's video is going to be freestanding, relatively short, and it's not going to be part of a larger series, though I am returning to a theme that I have discussed before. That theme is what I've dubbed a priori history. I want to preface this by repeating something I've said before. Historical inferences are always non-deductive, and so we're going to be making judgments. You will hear me, and you will hear anyone who's doing good historical research saying, I think it is more probable that this would happen if this theory were true than if this theory were true. So we're going to be using those counterfactual statements. This would be more probable on this theory than on its negation, than if it's false, or would be more probable on this theory than on this theory. That's not per se what I've dubbed a priori history, which I mean to be, by definition, illegitimate. I also tend not to use the phrase in a place where it does apply, but I just don't tend to use it there for an anti-supernatural bias. Miracles just never happen. That's kind of an extreme case of a priori history, so I'm not saying it doesn't apply. But it gets us into deeper philosophical issues of metaphysics and so forth. Where I tend to apply the word is to a special kind of scholarly arrogance that I have found, especially, I'm sorry to say, among New Testament scholars. Probably there are examples among Old Testament scholars as well, when it applies to reports of non-miraculous events, where from a common sense point of view, historical humility would seem to be very much called for. The document in question has a far better claim to be able to tell us whether or not this thing happened than we at our distance of time have. So it comes from much closer to the time, and especially when it concerns complex social matters that in human interactions are not going to be subject to a priori analysis. A few examples. The statement that a fisherman from Galilee could never have been known to the high priest, and therefore that if the other disciple was the author of the fourth gospel, he couldn't have been John, the son of Zebedee, because it says that other disciple was known to the high priest. You will hear that. You'll hear it even from people who think that the author was an eyewitness, but who are advocating the theory that he was someone else named John. You'll also hear it from more liberal scholars who think that, whoever he was, we have no idea, and he certainly wasn't John, the son of Zebedee. But in either case, it's being used to argue something that just would never happen, even though the word known in that case can cover a whole range of levels of acquaintance and friendship, all the way from mere acquaintance over to being a kinsman and in between. So it needn't mean that he was close friends with the high priest. So how do we know so much about social mobility and social interactions and class status and so forth at the time of Jesus that we can say never, never, never could it ever be said, however briefly, however passing a fashion, that he was known to the high priest of a Galilean fisherman? Now that's an example of a priori history, especially when it's said very dogmatically. Similarly, in the series that I've just completed, saying that the Pharisees would never have sent priest and Levite messengers to ask John the Baptist if he was the Messiah. This gets into questions of exactly what level of authority Pharisees had, whether Pharisees could have been working with priests and Levites. I mean, the verses don't say that they forced the priests to go against their will to ask John the Baptist that question. And similarly, could they have joined with the chief priests, as it says in John 18, to send the guards who eventually arrested Jesus. Well, we even have, as I pointed out, statements from Josephus that actually show us the priests working with prominent Pharisees. So this is by no means far-fetched. And yet the claim that John is non-historically altering the role of the Pharisees is said in this very super confident way. No, he's attributing an authority to them that they didn't have. By the way, I didn't know this when I finished recording that series, but I stumbled upon, literally, when I was reading a book by the Jesus Seminar, by Funk and the Jesus Seminar, The Acts of Jesus, I think it's called. For my next series, I stumbled upon a place where the Jesus Seminar makes exactly this same claim, that John is, fictionalizing partially the role of the Pharisees. And yet I was discussing it as made by relatively more conservative scholar Craig Keener, but it was it's the very same claim. Exactly how much power the Pharisees had, or whom they would or wouldn't have worked with, it's exactly one of those complex social questions where John has far greater authority to be taken as a source on that complex question. Or another one would be, Jesus would never have been allowed to continue his ministry if he had cleansed the temple early. So those are cases where it would seem commonsensically that historical humility from us 2,000 years later is very much in order, rather than making these extremely strong, confident, dogmatic statements that this group of people would never have allowed this, or would never have worked with that group of people, or this guy would never have known this guy, and so forth. So I'm going to give you an example today of a case that I think would be right in there, okay, where I discovered something just the other day while I was out driving. And I thought to myself, if I were engaging in a priori history, then, and I, Lydia, reported this, and then I, Lydia, number 2, were a scholar years later engaging in a priori history, I would dismiss Lydia number 1's report. I was out driving, and I was coming toward a light, coming up near the car in front of me, and I noticed that it had a Michigan license plate with only 5 digits. I've lived in Michigan since 1995, and it's now 2025, so 30 years. I have never seen a Michigan license plate with only 5 digits, not that I ever took note of until that day. I've seen 6-digit license plates. I've seen 7-digit license plates. Probably seen 7 digits more often than 6 digits, but I've never seen 5 digits. And it was offset somewhat. It was like as if something was missing at the beginning, and then it was to one side. And if I had only caught a brief glimpse, that's all I would have been able to say. If I'd just seen it quickly, I would have just said, that's funny. I saw a Michigan license plate with only 5 digits. As I pulled up closer to the car in front of me, because we were coming up to a light, we were slowing down, I saw that underneath it said veteran. Underneath the digits in black letters, still big enough to read, it said veteran. And then I also noticed that diagonally across that open space at the beginning, there was some word in smaller letters. Well, I was really curious now, so I scooted up just a little closer to the guy, and I peered. I'm a little bit nearsighted, but I have my glasses on, and I saw that diagonal word said Afghanistan. So now I know something that I didn't know before, which is that there's a special kind of veteran's license plate that you can get in Michigan, showing where you served. I did a little more Googling on it just before I'm recording this video. It looks like it relates especially to disabled veterans. And then at the beginning of it, in place of where you would normally have other digits, at least one more, you can have the place that name of the place where you served printed there. That's pretty cool. But I had never known that until I saw that license plate. And suppose that I had just reported that. Not even with all the stuff about pulling up and seeing the word veteran and the word Afghanistan. Like, leave all that out. And there's no Google, right? At least not in our imaginary future, when a historian is examining these things and sees a statement that I make. I saw a license plate and it had only 5 digits, a Michigan license plate. And let's suppose that this later historian, like me now prior to this, has only heard of 6-digit and 7-digit Michigan license plates driving on the highways in the 2020s. Funny, when I was Googling, somebody was selling or claimed to be selling a 5-digit Michigan license plate from 1920. So, maybe they had fewer digits back then. Oh, that would just be such fodder for a priori history. Oh, she's clearly off by 100 years. They didn't have 5-digit Michigan license plates on cars driving on the road in the year 2025. This must have some symbolic meaning, or she's doing it for some thematic reason, because it couldn't have really literally been the case. But in fact, it did really happen. Now, that kind of nitty-gritty thing, how many digits can there be on a Michigan license plate, is, in my opinion, very much the same kind of thing as, would Pharisees and priests work together to send guards to arrest somebody who was they both considered to be a troublemaker. They both hated him at the time of Jesus. Would the Pharisees, would any Pharisees, it doesn't mean the entirety of the body of Pharisees, or it doesn't have to mean that, but would there be Pharisees who would have had sufficient authority to be sending messengers who included priests and Levites to ask someone who he thought he was, that being John the Baptist? I mean, that's, how in the world can you possibly know that from your armchair, one way or the other? What we need are reports from the time period of what the Pharisees actually did, and whom they cooperated with, and so forth. We have that from Josephus, but we also have that from the Gospels. Records of the Pharisees doing stuff. And as such, the Gospels are a very important source of information about first century customs. Insofar as we can check on this, they actually agree with Josephus. So why in the world would you sit there and say, oh, this would never have happened? But once something becomes a sort of meme, as it were, among scholars, they just keep repeating it. They just keep taking in each other's laundry. Oh, as if they would ever allow Jesus to continue his ministry if he had cleansed the temple early, and then they presumably all sit around and say, yeah, that's really crazy, man, and you need someone from outside to come and say, that's not really that crazy. When you read the Gospel of John, it tells the story of Jesus' ministry, and if we didn't have the Synoptic Gospels telling of a cleansing later in his ministry, no one, I think, would ever think to question that particular ordering of the temple cleansing early, followed by the rest of the ministry. John makes it, he tells a lot of things that show it to be plausible. Jesus traveling back and forth between Galilee and Jerusalem, and having trouble in Jerusalem, but being popular with the people, and how that restrains the malice and what the religious leaders are able to accomplish, and so on and so on and so on. So there's nothing so strange about that. We need to shake free of that, just as it would be silly to say there could never have been a 5-digit license plate in 2025 in Michigan driving on the roads it's silly to say there could never have been cooperation between the Pharisees and the chief priests to send guards to arrest Jesus at the time of Jesus. So I give that to you for what it's worth. I enjoyed thinking of that. When I got home, I said, I've got a great illustration for a priori history. And that'll nicely round off the previous series before I start the next one on misunderstandings of the Jesus Seminar. So please come back next time to my channel where we're making common sense rigorous.